Fantastic. So thank you for coming along, guys, to Network Educate Invite Business Support Program. Today, we're lucky enough to have Dr. Fiona Price talking to us about multiculturalism in the workplace. So, Fiona, the floor is yours.
Floor is mine. Okay, thank you very much, Jay, for inviting me to present at Be Connect. What Be Connected or BBX? What do you call it?
Well, this is Network Educate Invite.
Network Educate. All right, I'm just going to try and figure out which incarnation this is looking at. All right, so let's start afresh. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about today is the sort of things that my business does, which is helping people navigate the differences between cultures. And so I'll probably spend maybe the first 10 minutes or so just giving you an introduction to my business, how it works, a look at how I look at culture, which is in a very practical way, because I treat it as a practical challenge that needs to be addressed. And that's one of the things that I find quite useful, because often when people want to know about cultural differences, what they're actually wanting is help with their own business, because they're finding that cultural differences are starting to have an impact on how it's working. So to give you, go to a basic background on why I developed my business. The thing is, we're currently in a quite new and unique era of human history. In the last 50 years, we've actually got a lot more people who've grown up in different societies engaging with each other. They're studying together or teaching each other. They're working together in the workplace. They're outsourcing work from their own society to other societies. So we've got a lot more people who are connecting with other people who didn't grow up in the same society as them. In lots of ways, that's very exciting. It's very interesting and creative. It creates lots of opportunities and ideas. But on the other hand, there are also some challenges that come up from people having grown up in different societies. And those are the sorts of challenges that I tackle so that we can better enjoy and work with the opportunities that cross-cultural collaboration can provide. And when it comes to differences between cultures, some of them are obvious and some of them aren't. Now, some of the obvious ones include that often you've got people working together who don't have the same native language, for example. So you might have some language barriers, some accents, some differences in vocabulary that you've got to work around when you're collaborating with each other. People from different countries tend to have very different names. That's something I work with a lot. So you've got to negotiate how to use each other's names correctly, and it might not be the way you're used to in the society where you've grown up. Names might be quite different in other countries. People are operating in different time zones. People have different priorities and lifestyles. They're sorts of things that are generally pretty obvious right from the start. Now, I do work on those, but because they're obvious, what I wanted to focus on today is some of the things which are a lot less obvious. So some of the less obvious issues which can be intervening is differences in our values, differences in how we understand the social world, so how to behave with other people. For example, things like punctuality. In Germany, if you're 5 minutes late, that's really late. That's quite offensive. That's quite insulting. That could be a major blight on the relationship with the person you're meeting. Lots of other countries, half an hour or more late is quite normal and it's not a major problem. Everyone expects it. No one's too bothered by it. But you can see if you've got someone from a more German mindset with someone from a half an hour late or half an hour plus late is okay, you can see there can be friction there. And that comes not from there being different people, but them having different ideas of punctuality from the societies where they grew up. Another one that you might find quite comes off a lot with when there's Australians working with people from other cultures is the idea of how you show respect to someone. Now in Australia, it's quite normal to address your boss by his or her first name. You might chat with them quite casually about things, and that's considered perfectly okay and appropriate. It's considered friendly. There's a sort of informality that's quite normal and quite expected. A lot of people from other countries expect formality with their boss. They would address their boss as sir or madam. They would address them very formally. They would only talk to them them in a way which they feel shows respect. Because of the different ideas of respect that are operating there, you can also have some difficulties coming up. One final example, I remember when I went to India, within the first minute of conversation after meeting people, people would ask me, "Are you married?" Now in Australia, that would be considered a not quite appropriate icebreaker. So these sorts of issues are the things that I'm dealing with most often in my work in cross-cultural training. People's different ideas about what's normal, what's appropriate, and so on that come from the society where they grew up. So why did I start a business in this area? And what I'll do now is I'll start sharing some slides, give you a bit of background on how I came to develop my business and what it is, then I'll give you some examples, some actual case studies of clients that I've worked with. So okay, you've got that all on your screen there. What we've got there is my full name with all of its different parts included. So names are something I work with a lot. So if you look at the outside of my name, the Fiona and the Price, those are both from my father, who is a white Australian, of Anglo-Celtic kind of British Isles origin. But you'll notice that in the middle of my name, I have something that doesn't look English at all. That is not from my father, who was born and raised in Australia and whose ancestors come from the British Isles. That comes from my mother, who was born and raised in Malaysia and whose ancestors come from Southeast China. So one of the things that I grew up doing was having to negotiate between my very different parents' views. Both of them had different ideas about how a child should behave, what sort of career was appropriate, what I should prioritize, how I should dress, how I should view family. And I found that I was having to kind of adapt depending on which parent I was with at the time and what sort of situation I was in. With on the front of my name, the doctor, I did my PhD at the University of Melbourne. And towards the end of that, I was doing a lot of work with international students. Because one of the areas where there's a lot of engagement between different cultures is in education. So I was helping international students understand Australian society, language and culture. Even if they were English speakers, Australian English is a different creature from the sort of English they learned when they were studying at school. And so I was helping them adapt. And then I moved on to helping staff. And I developed a couple of training programs which are designed to address the practical needs of people around cross-cultural communication. And those workshops were so popular that I decided I have some viable products and I can start my own business. So I left my job and I started a consulting firm to address people's cross-cultural needs. So what I do now is I am helping organisations and individuals navigate the sort of issues that I started learning about both from my childhood and from my work at universities. Give you a bit more specifics about the sort of things that I do. Some of those are the obvious things I mentioned before. One of those is looking at language barriers. And that's not just people can't understand things and you need an interpreter. It's also people using English differently, what it's like being someone speaking English as a second language, trying to read something written by a native speaker. So the sorts of things that I might do, I worked at a sports centre once, and they had very multicultural patrons, some of whom spoke English, so quite limited English. And what I did was I coached their front desk staff on how to speak clear, simple international English. I taught them how to de-Australianise their language. And I also went through all their brochures and their handbook so that I could help them rewrite that in more straightforward English, make it more visual to make it more accessible to people who aren't native English speakers. The other thing I do lots of is I do a lot of helping people with multicultural names. And as you can see from those three examples there, the first one is Chinese, the second one is Turkish, and the third one is Sri Lankan. In lots of cases, people who have to use names which come from other languages are really struggling. So one of the things that I do is I teach people how to put names like these into their databases, which part to call people by. And also the other thing that I do is I help people say them when they have to read them at an awards ceremony, or I read them at award ceremonies myself. But probably the most important things that I'm doing from the perspective of today's session is that I'm looking at how those less obvious differences work, how to make it easier for people to engage successfully in the workplace with people who come from a different society. All right, so what I'd now like to do is I'd like to turn the things back to you and get you to have a think about management. Because most of you either are managers or you've been managed or you've had managers before. I'd like you to think about what does a good manager do? So maybe think about 3 things that they do, not adjectives as in polite or respectful or friendly, things that they actually do. So if you think a good manager is friendly, what do they do to be friendly? What sort of behaviour do you see? The other one, what does a bad manager do? Think maybe of 3 things that a bad manager you might have had does. So I'll give you 30 seconds to have a quick think about that. And then we'll have a little quiz to look at how your ideas around managers.
We need to play some music in the background.
A little bit of, maybe I should put some of my songs on there.
I love very music.
All right. Okay, let's just relaunch this poll. Now, in this poll, I'm going to have to de-Australianize it. So again, before we relaunch the poll, this is a quick other thought for you. And that is that when you're thinking about what makes a good manager or what makes a bad manager, you didn't get those ideas from nowhere. You've obviously learned how a good manager behaves. And often we're not necessarily thinking about managers in a workplace when we're thinking about what qualities make someone a good manager. What we're actually thinking about is what makes someone a good leader. And managers aren't the only leaders we experience. In fact, they're comparatively late in life. Often the first leaders we meet are maybe our parents, maybe our grandparents, our school teachers, people who, the person who runs our scouting group, all those sorts of things. So what I'd like you to think about for this poll, and ignore the Australians bit, just think about people that you know. Where do you think most people learn what makes a good or bad leader? Have a think about what sort of leaders you might be drawing on if you're going to have to be a leader in some circumstance. So I'll relaunch this poll, and the idea is to tick the 3 top boxes of the sorts of leaders that you were drawing on when you talk about a good leader or a bad leader. Maybe you saw someone who was a very bad teacher, but you learned from that about how to be a good teacher, for example. So you learned from them that, oh, my teacher used to yell and shout, and I really didn't think that was good leadership. So I've learned from that a good leader doesn't need to shout, and it doesn't create a good atmosphere. So think about that. See if you can answer the poll. Don't worry about the Australians. Just think about where do you think most people learn what makes a good or bad leader? So that's most people. And then the second question, ask you the same thing again, but for you personally, for you as an individual, from your life experience, what are the people you learned most about leadership from?
Can everybody see the poll?
Poll up.
Can everybody click on something? Because as a host, I can't do that.
I can see the poll okay. The second question though.
Oh, you got to scroll down using the little bar on the side.
Oh yeah, got it.
Yep. Okay, so see, click 3 each where you think you've learned about leadership. So whether they were good or bad, if you learned something from them.
Yeah, do that. You do that as well, girls, please. I want to know what you think.
There should be all the above on.
Very instructive for Jay.
Sorry?
There should be
I lost the sheet.
Fiona, you don't have a box for other.
Yeah,
number
all,
2.
Oh, yes, I do.
All
Down
the
the bottom.
above, number 1.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. Keep
There is
scrolling.
another. Not down the bottom.
Okay.
I had to set up very specific instructions to set that up today,
Oh, yeah.
so don't tell me it's wrong.
All right, we don't actually have that. Oh, we got some answers. Good, that's what I like to see.
Oh, there we go. We're starting to get them come
Nice.
through.
No, good.
3.
Beautiful.
2 people still got to do it.
Jay, cracking the whip.
Mate, come on. That's not what a good manager should do.
No, probably not. Maybe they're learning from you, Jay, but how not to be a good manager.
Now, while people are filling that in, something you brought up earlier about cultures and how you address your manager. And I started giggling to myself because the girls, when they started for me, and this is obviously a Filipino culture thing, even when I interviewed them, called me Sir Jay. And I had to go, no, my name's Jay. I am not Sir Jay. I am not better than you. I might pay your wages, but I am not better than you. I am not Sir. Yeah,
that tells you a lot.
Obviously, a cultural thing.
It is. It tells you a lot, though, about your personal ideas about leadership, Jay. You say, I'm not better than you. You feel that a leader shouldn't put himself, in your case, above others. And and you don't want people to address you as if you're above them.
No, because that's a manager.
So
and they still did it for a couple of weeks. They started, no, stop calling me sir. Stop it. John, you need to call me sir. All right.
Huh?
But you see how important, how deeply ingrained that is. About that, there are different ideas about how to show you respect coming through.
Yeah. Who's not filled their thing?
One person who hasn't answered the poll yet. Should we just wrap it up there with the one person hanging, or should we?
Yeah, just
wait
wrap it up. We're not
wrap it up. Okay, good. All right, I'll show you the results of that poll later. But first of all, what I'd now like to do is share my screen again. Let's have a little bit of a think about culture. And there's a reason why I asked you what a good manager and what a bad manager does first. Because one of the things that culture tells us is what good is and what bad is. Anytime you make a value judgment, such as that was good management, oh, that was really polite, or even something as basic as you look nice, you've got to draw on some kind of standard. You need to know what good looks like to say that someone's good or bad. You've got some ideas and standards and values which tell you how to make a value judgment about someone's behavior or someone's outfit or anything about them. Let's have a look then at what culture is. So often when you get people talking about culture, they have very complicated definitions of what it is. They're saying things like, oh, it's the way of life, customs, beliefs, and behaviors. It's it's a half a paragraph definition. And I say, when people want to learn about cultural differences, usually they want to understand them and know what to do about them. And having a full page definition is not very helpful. You want to keep it straightforward, you want to keep it practical. And I say one of the most straightforward definitions of culture is the stuff you have to learn. Anything that comes naturally, that's not cultural. Anything that you're born with, that's hereditary. That's biology. Anything you have to learn is cultural. All right, so if you look here, if you go right back to the beginning, it's helpful to go right back to the beginning to show you what culture actually is. All right, so right back to the beginning, let's have a look at this. This is the very beginning. That is my second son when he was about 2 days old. And what could he do at this point? What could he do without learning anything? Well, not a lot, but he did have a couple of things he could do. He could breathe, he could eat, he could drink milk at least, he could excrete, he could sleep occasionally when, he was feeling I've been considerate to his exhausted mother, but he hadn't actually learned to do much else. So from there, apart from these things he was born knowing how to do, he had to learn how and when to eat. Eventually you teach a baby how to eat solid food. I had to toilet train him because you've got to teach him how to excrete appropriately in the culture in which he's born, how to eat appropriately. You need to teach him. Sleep training a baby is about teaching them to sleep appropriately in the society where the baby's been born. Now, at this age, he could cry and then that would, people would respond to his needs. But as his needs get more complex and he gets a bit older, he needed to learn how to speak. So that then he needs to learn how to say please and thank you, how to make eye contact when talking. So all of the things that you have to learn, they're all going to be culturally related to the culture in which you're at, to make sure that you can engage appropriately with other people in your society. You also need to be able to tell, is this person a person that's going to help me or hinder me? Is this person a danger to me? You need to learn how to read other people's behavior. Now, at this very small age, there's not that much difference between cultures. There are some, but there aren't huge differences. But the older you get and the more complex it is, the more what you learn is tailored for the society that you are growing up in and need to fit into. So let's have a look now at our poll results. So let's see, share the results. Coming up, okay, beautiful. All right, so looking up here at our results, we've got everybody put their family and formal education as one of the top 2 influences when people are deciding, where people learn things. So while your family is a bit personal to you. And your family could be a bit eccentric. You could have some, there are some families that I believe live in the sort of north coast of New South Wales who are breastfeeding babies until they're 10 and all that sort of stuff. So your parents might be a bit different from society. But when you start looking at things like, especially traditional media, formal education, learning things from the government, a lot of people will share those influences in common with you if you grew up in the same society. Let's have a look down here, and you'll notice that it's a bit different when you look at question 2. So when people say what most people think is a good or bad leader, you're nominating different things from what you actually say personally. So while people come from a society which tells them these are the sort of places where you might learn about things, your own personal take on them can differ depending on what sort of person that you are. So, but the things that you learn that you share in common with other people in your society tend to be things which are shared across a society. This is where culture comes from. It's the sort of ideas that you share because they're put out by sources that people share in common, like the government. If you live in Australia, you live under Australian law, you'll have to go through the Australian school system. And if you are homeschooled, which is quite rare, you're often quite outside the norm and you're exposed to Australian media. So if we go back to our slide, have a look at what this actually does. So if you're growing up in the same country, you tend to share a lot of influences and get a lot of messages about what's normal. Your teacher is modelling leadership, and teachers don't happen in a vacuum. They have to attend a course by law. They have to attend a Bachelor of Education, or they have to do a dip ed, and they have to teach in a way which is considered appropriate. The government sets the rules around that. The way the education system works, the government sort of controls what sort of media programs get released to as children's programs to make sure they fit the values of society. So a lot of the same messages are getting out to the people who live in the same society. So what you're getting is a shared understanding of what good leadership looks like. You know, you see people in the television news, you see people being framed to see this person as being a bad leader because they're doing this. And you get this person as being rewarded, being interviewed and treated like a hero because they're being a good leader. You're seeing a lot of messages about how people should behave there. Now, you might share those messages, and people often have an issue here. They say, yes, but maybe that's normal in the Philippines, but I'm Filipino and I'm not like that. You know, I'm Australian. I don't follow all these Australian cultural norms. And that's because individual people don't necessarily embrace what their society tells them they should do. They'll do that to a greater or lesser extent, depending on how old they are. Now, anyone who's getting old and says young people these days just show no respect, what they're saying is they used to be right here in the middle of the bell curve where, you know, society agreed, the messages in society agreed with the way they personally felt, and they're getting old and they're finding themselves sliding it down away from what's considered normal these days, and they don't like it.
That's me, grumpy old man. That's me.
Right. That's right.
Well, truly. Yeah.
Men and women, the famous double standard, there is a double standard. Men are rewarded for different things than women. What men are told is good behaviour, what women are told is good behaviour, there's a bit of difference there. I have a Malaysian Chinese mother, so I have a bit of a more Chinese flavour to how I react to Australian norms. But you still know what the norms are, even if you don't personally respect them or like them. That's why we have jails. That's why we sack people. That's why we sometimes break up with our friends, because we decided, we're just on a different page here. Now, that's understanding that a lot of what we think is normal and appropriate and polite comes from the society we grew up, helps us understand why cultural differences exist. Because if you think about it, we're growing up in Australia, Australian government, Australian media, they're all sending us all these messages. We've got a little manual in our head which tells us what's normal, what's appropriate, what's polite. We don't agree with it, but we know what it is. However, if you say you grew up in China, so you're on the Australian bell curve somewhere. So if you grew up in China, Chinese government, very different from the Australian government, very different approach to leadership. Chinese media, very different language for a start, but also different messages about what normal, good and polite are. Chinese schools run very differently. Classroom of 60 children, teachers speak, students listen. You're not supposed to, there isn't that sort of dialogue you get in an Australian classroom. Very different messages about how you treat a leader, what respectful behaviour is, and so on. So if you've grown up in China, you've got very different ideas about what's normal, polite, appropriate, and so on. And you're on the Chinese bell curve. And the thing is, there's a difference between what people consider polite, normal, and appropriate. Doesn't mean to say there won't be some Chinese people who actually, migrate to Australia because they quite like Australian norms. They fit better with them personally, or Australians who think, geez, the Chinese have got a few things right there. But where this gap is, people have different ideas about how a manager should behave, how an employee should behave. That is where the challenges tend to come up, where there's a difference between the two handbooks, what the two handbooks are saying. So let's have a look at what that can actually mean in a more concrete kind of way. So one of the things I say it comes from, that culture comes from, coming from the media. So we don't have a lot of people who have actually grown up in Australia. Does any of you know what this ad's about?
Drink driving.
How do you know that, Jay?
Because I saw it, and it makes logical sense. Bit over the limit.
Bit over the limit. All right. So, okay. So you've seen it. So that shows you've seen it. It's in the media. You've seen it. And because there is no mention of alcohol or driving anywhere in there. You just know. And a lot of culture is the stuff that you just know. Notice something else about it. When I picked up some Indian international students to drive them down to Monash, the first time they'd been in Australia, they saw this billboard and they were shocked. Why do you think that was? Yes, Jay?
Because in their culture, that would be disgusting swearing.
It would. It would indeed.
Yeah,
it has a swear word. So who was that, sorry?
Because it's got you bloody idiot.
Yes, it has. The government is abusing them from a billboard. They didn't know it was the government. They looked at it and they said, Madam, what is that sign? There is a swear word on that billboard. They said to me. And I said, yes, there is. Sorry about that. And they said, why doesn't the government stop it? They said. And I had to say, it's a government billboard. And they were even more shocked. But why were they so shocked? Because you can see there the messages they got in India about how a leader should behave do not include swearing at the general public from a 10-foot high billboard. They thought that was shocking and inappropriate behaviour, and they thought that the government should set a good example. They should use appropriate language. They shouldn't swear, and so on. But it's been a very successful ad campaign in Australia because it does fit the Australian kind of norm about leadership. It's casual, it's informal. Like Jay, it's not putting the leader above other people, above ordinary people. It's treating them as if they're a mate at the pub. And it's using swear words to show how down to earth it is. So that ad campaign started in 1989. It's still going. That is the definition of a very successful marketing campaign. Now,
it's very disrespectful in actual fact.
Well, it works for Australians. So clearly for Australians, they don't feel disrespected. They actually like it. It worked for them. This ad, on the other hand, was not successful. So why was it not successful? Okay, any thoughts? Anyone know anything about this ad campaign? Yes, Jay.
So on this one, right? So that was what's her name? Lara Bingle.
It was Lara Bingle.
Did that, and similar to the last one, so that was made for the Australian market. So Australians related to that ad. This was actually made for the overseas market and offended everybody that it was actually targeting.
Right, because this was designed. This is Tourism Australia. It was designed by our current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. Actually, he was the head of Tourism Australia at this time. And it was designed to attract international tourists to Australia. And it was a disaster. Cost $8 or $9 million. Tourism actually went down after as a result of it, and it was banned in several countries. But there was selective ban. In Singapore, they said they're not allowed to use bloody or hell. In the US, they objected to the hell, so that had to be removed. In the UK, they objected to the bloody, so they had to take that out. And it actually damaged tourism rather than increasing it. But what went wrong? The bloody worked so well for the TAC. Why didn't it work for Tourism Australia? Because they'd written an ad for Australians and pitched it to people outside Australia. So these are Australians assuming that if it works in Australia, it universally works, it'll work everywhere. And this is a classic example of how culture shock works. You're assuming that everybody thinks the same way that you do, that everybody values it and finds this approach, down to earth and humorous and irreverent, and they like that and will attract them and be able to be effective. Whereas actually, people that didn't grow up in the same society as you, that sort of approach doesn't necessarily work. All right, so that's one of the sort of thing that comes up a lot when people are running small businesses. If they're assuming, they assume a lot of things about the way that when they're working with people from other societies, they assume that they think the same way as the same way as they do, and often they don't. All right, let's just see. All right, so let's just quickly give you two case studies of actual clients that I worked with. So in this one, I had a small architecture firm, so only kind of 4 or 5 people, and the manager was Anglo-Australian, so he was born and grew up here, and he just hired a new Filipino staff member. Now, obviously, this person's on the Filipino bell curve. We've got several Filipinos here today. This might not be their experience of having grown up in the Philippines, but this is what I had reported to me by the manager. He said that he was hoping, what I figured out what was happening, talking to the Filipino staff member, that he was used to getting really clear, explicit instructions on what to do. He'd never worked with a Western English speaker before. He was used to a manager or a teacher providing really clear, explicit instructions. He's a new graduate. He's never worked under somebody who was a Westerner before. And his job, he saw it as to follow the instructions his manager gave him to the letter, to follow them perfectly. He also felt that it wasn't his place to actually question, ask for clarification, ask the boss for further instruction. He felt that was disrespectful. It implied the boss hadn't given him clear guidelines. It implied that he was challenging the boss's authority or undermining it. He noticed also in his work that there are some issues with the customer database, but he didn't raise them because he wasn't told to look at that. He didn't get instructions about that. And he didn't want to imply the boss had done something wrong or hired a bad software package. From the Australian manager's point of view, he said, look, my assistant, my new Filipino assistant, very hardworking, very polite, but sometimes I don't think he understood the instructions. And this is a real issue. And he should take responsibility. If he doesn't understand my instructions, he should show some initiative and ask clarification. Instead, he was making all these weird guesses and getting it wrong. And he's noticed there was an issue with the database, but he didn't mention it. This is something that affects the whole team. When he noticed that, he should have told me. so it could have been fixed. So, he wondered perhaps he was, the employee was feeling too intimidated to ask him. So he tried to be warmer and more friendly. And eventually he came to me saying, look, I think he just wants to be spoon-fed. He doesn't have much initiative. And he thought, I might actually have to look at firing and hiring someone else. And it's a big burden for a small business and so on. What actually was happening, of course, they've got different expectations about how management's meant to work. And, his idea, his expectations didn't line up. The way he delivered his instructions didn't line up with what his staff member was expecting from a manager. So what I needed to do was unpack what they each expected of each other and kind of forge some practical middle ground to improve communication, and also teach the Filipino staff member what his boss was expecting. The sort of showing initiative thing wasn't something he'd ever had before. So needing to teach him and give him concrete examples of how to do what he wanted, and the manager to communicate much more explicitly and take him through it. And one of the other things which he found helped was to getting one of his other young staff members to be a bit of a liaison, because he found his Filipino staff member felt more comfortable talking to someone closer to his own age. Now, the other example I'll quickly give you just before I'll finish the session is at a home interiors firm. All right. So we had a lot of Anglo-Australian sales consultants, and they were working with people and picking the furnishings, their lounge rooms, their kitchen and so on. And they had a lot of Indian customers. And one of the things that's interesting is they said, look, we're having a lot of trouble here. There's a lot of trouble with the decision making. The process seems to be taking a huge amount of time. It's putting a massive burden on it, and our staff are getting stressed. So they said, can you come and watch what happens? So I went into the day and I watched these consultants working with Indian customers. We had one couple come up, and they were Punjabi. They were from northwest India, and the wife was talking to the consultant. And the consultant was saying, so what would you like for the tiles in your kitchen? What sort of oven would you like? What colour would you like for your bench tops, that sort of stuff? And the customer kept on asking her for suggestions, saying, oh, maybe this one is good. But what do you think? She said to the consultant. Do you think this is a good one? Maybe this colour is better. What do you think? And the consultant said, it's your decision. It's not my kitchen. It's your kitchen. And then eventually the customers were getting really frustrated. They said, you're the expert, you're the consultant. We need you to tell us. We don't know about who makes a good kitchen. I don't want people to come to my house and tell me you spent this much money and this is all you got. And what we actually had there was different priorities. What the Indian customers are used to a society where the brand of your family is really important. The impression you give to other people in the community is really important. It can affect your future employment, your future accommodation, your marriage opportunities for your children. And, so it's important to build your family brand. And so having a home which is appropriately furnished and beautiful is part of that brand. And she wanted expert advice from the consultant on how to give a good impression. That was her key priority. For the consultant used to working with Anglo-Australians, what's most important is what you like, your personal taste and preferences. She had this more Australian mindset. You shouldn't focus on impressing other people. You should be true to yourself, make authentic choices, and other people should respect that that's your taste. It's not their kitchen, it's mine. I'm going to choose what I want for my kitchen. And so, but the consultant found this frustrating. She said, well, these Indians we work with, a lot of them don't seem to know what they want, and they seem to want me to make the decisions about their kitchen. So what I had to do was look at, helping the staff understand and respect the Indian customers' priorities, and look at ways to give them a choice in a way that worked with their priorities and to communicate with them in that sort of way. So those are the sorts of things that I tend to do in my work. It's helping people understand what sort of things, what sort of cultural differences might be, how they might be impacting their company. So if I just look at, just sort of wrap up by going sort of summarising. So effectively, navigating cultural junctions, it's things like helping people manage language barriers, helping people use multicultural names effectively, and things like helping people negotiate different cultural differences, and help to make communication more effective and come up with practical solutions to be more efficient, more positive working environment. So what I talked about there with the Indian customers at the interiors firm, my approach tends to be, this is the sort of things you see. So I'm often asking people, what sort of things have you observed? What challenges have come up? They said the customers don't know what they want. That immediately flags the Australians are individualists. It's all about personal taste and preferences. Whereas the Indians are often about giving a good impression to others. So what their priority is going to be is that giving a good impression. So we've got a mismatch of expectations there. So what you see is often a good reflection of what your values actually are, what's happening in the situation. The next thing I usually do is I have a no blame analysis. It's not anyone's fault. It's not that the Indians are shallow and worry what other people think of them, and the Australians are not doing their job properly, not giving me proper advice on how to create an impressive kitchen. It's understanding why those differences are coming up and unpacking that a bit, and then giving my clients some practical steps that they can take to address the problem, improve communication, understand their customers or understand their students or understand their affiliates in another organisation better, and how to create a sort of positive, constructive way to move forward so that everyone can do business happily. So that's kind of the analysis of how my business works, Jay. You were going to ask a couple of questions of me at the end or something, or open the floor?
Yeah, anybody got any questions? I do have one for the people that are not here and can't talk to you right now. How do people get hold of you?
How do people get hold of me?
Yes.
I have a website, I have an email address, I have a phone number. Would you like me to?
I'd like you to tell that for the people that are listening on video.
All right. Okay. My website, Globalise spelt with an S, the Australian/UK, globalise.net.au is my website. That gives you a more in-depth overview of the sorts of things that I do. I'm available on LinkedIn under Fiona Swelin Price, Director of Globalise Consulting. And you can also contact me by email directly at globalise@internode, internode.on.net. You're welcome to email me and ask any questions you might have about my business and the services that I offer.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Fiona.